Why is the Imperial Japanese Navy's Nagato still sitting upside down at the bottom of a lagoon nobody can easily reach? I don't mean how it got there. If you're watching this video, you probably already know the broad strokes. But if you don't, the Nagato was the most famous battleship Japan ever built. The ship Admiral Yamamoto stood on when he gave the order to attack Pearl Harbor, and one of only 2 Japanese battleships still afloat by the time the war ended. The Americans took it as a war prize, sailed it to a remote Pacific atoll, and detonated 2 atomic bombs near it. It survived the first one. It didn't survive the second. What I want to know is why, almost 80 years later, it's still down there. Nobody has salvaged it. Nobody has even seriously tried. And the reasons turn out to be a tangle of radioactivity, economics, and a strange kind of historical reverence that nobody expected back in 1946. To understand why nobody's come back for the Nagato, you have to start with what it actually was. The Nagato was laid down in 1917 and completed in 1920. And when it entered service, it was the most powerful battleship on the planet. It was the first warship in the world built around 16-inch guns, 8 of them, mounted in 4 twin turrets, each barrel capable of throwing a shell more than 20 miles. It displaced close to 47,000 tons fully loaded and stretched 738 feet from bow to stern. Japan was so proud of it, and so anxious about revealing its capabilities to rival navies, that the ship's top speed was officially classified as a state secret for years. Alongside its sister ship, the Mutsu, the Nagato became a symbol of Japanese naval ambition, one of what naval observers at the time called the Big Seven, the most powerful battleships in the world in the years between the wars. For ordinary Japanese citizens, the Nagato wasn't just a warship, it was a national icon, the physical proof that Japan belonged among the great naval powers. That status is exactly why Yamamoto chose it as his flagship. On December 7th, 1941, Hawaii time, while Japanese carrier aircraft were already in the air, heading toward Pearl Harbor, the coded order to proceed with the attack went out from the Nagato's bridge, anchored in Hiroshima Bay. The most symbolically loaded moment in the entire Pacific War happened on that ship. A few months later, once the new battleship Yamato was finished, the flagship duties passed to her instead, and the Nagato spent much of the rest of the war in a strange, almost secondary role, escorting carrier groups and sitting in reserve, occasionally moving between bases while Japan tried to figure out how to use its remaining big gun ships in a war that carrier aircraft were quietly making obsolete. But the Nagato wasn't finished. In October 1944, it took part in the Battle of Leyte Gulf as part of Admiral Kurita's center force, and during the chaotic engagement off Samar, it actually opened fire on American ships, one of the only times in the entire war a Japanese battleship traded shots directly with the US Navy in a surface action. It took damage and pulled back, but it survived. By July 1945, though, the war had turned into something the Nagato couldn't out-survive through firepower. American carrier aircraft hit the ship hard during raids on the Yokosuka naval base, and it ended the war heavily damaged, camouflaged, listing, barely afloat at its moorings. When Japan formally surrendered, American sailors specifically boarded the Nagato ahead of the official surrender ceremony. The US Navy later described that act as a deliberate symbol, a way of saying that the Imperial Japanese Navy, the force that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack, was now completely under American control. From there, the ship's fate was sealed in a different way. It was selected as a target vessel for Operation Crossroads, the US nuclear weapons tests planned for the summer of 1946 at Bikini Atoll. The Nagato was in such poor condition by this point that getting it across the Pacific wasn't simple. It had to be towed for much of the journey, a damaged, half-dead symbol of a navy that no longer existed, dragged toward the one place where its destruction could be turned into a demonstration of American power. The first test, codenamed Able, was an airburst detonated on July 1st, 1946. The Nagato was positioned roughly 1,500 meters from ground zero. It came through with only moderate damage, wrinkled plating, blown-off doors, scorched paint. Remarkably, a skeleton crew was able to board the ship afterward and actually run one of its boilers for 36 hours without any serious problems. For the US military, this was an embarrassment. The entire point of Crossroads was to prove that nuclear weapons could obliterate even the most powerful warships afloat. And instead, Japan's most symbolically important battleship was sitting there largely intact, so they moved it. For the second test, Baker on July the 25th, the Nagato was positioned only 870 meters from ground zero, and this time the bomb was detonated underwater rather than in the air. The result was completely different. A column of water more than a mile high erupted out of the lagoon and came crashing back down across the entire target fleet, drenching every ship in radioactive spray. When the water settled, the Nagato was still floating. According to the Navy's own records, mines had even been strapped to its hull beforehand, specifically to help finish the job, and it still wasn't enough. The list was only about 2 degrees. Once again, this stubborn, half-wrecked battleship had refused to go down on command. But the Baker test had done something the first one hadn't. It hadn't just damaged the ships physically, it had coated every surface of every vessel in the fleet with radioactive seawater. The Nagato was now so contaminated that nobody could approach within 1,000 yards of it. Crews tried hosing it down from a distance to wash the radioactivity off, and it made no real difference. With nobody able to board the ship and nobody able to stop whatever slow flooding had started, the Americans could only watch from a distance as the list crept upward day by day. 3 days after the test, it had reached 8 degrees. It kept climbing after that. On the night of July the 29th, 1946, with no crew aboard, no ceremony, and apparently nobody even watching closely at that exact moment, the most famous warship in Japanese history rolled over and slipped beneath the surface. By morning, the spot where it had been sitting was simply empty water. Now here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, because the Nagato came to rest upside down in roughly 170 feet of water, which is deep, but it is absolutely not unreachable. Wrecks in far worse condition and at far greater depths have been salvaged before. So why has this one been left completely alone for nearly 80 years? The first and most obvious problem was radioactivity. In the months after the Baker test, the Navy did try to decontaminate as much of the target fleet as it could, scrubbing decks, flushing hulls, replacing whatever equipment could be removed. Out of dozens of target ships, only 9 of them ever made it through that process clean enough to be considered safe and were eventually sold for scrap. The rest were simply too hot. The Nagato hadn't been boarded since before the Baker detonation, which meant nobody actually knew the precise state of its contamination, because nobody could get close enough to check. And in the late 1940s, with the entire field of nuclear science barely a few years old, there wasn't exactly a long line of volunteers willing to find out the hard way. The second problem was pure geography. Bikini Atoll sits in the Marshall Islands, in the middle of the Pacific, roughly 2,500 miles from Hawaii. There's no port nearby, no shipbreaking yard, no heavy lifting equipment sitting around waiting to be used. Any serious salvage operation would have to ship every piece of equipment across thousands of miles of open ocean before a single cutting torch ever touched the hull. That logistics problem alone makes the economics brutal before you've even accounted for the radiation. The third reason is the part that genuinely surprised me when I looked into it, because it involves something called low background steel. The Nagato was built in 1920, decades before the first nuclear detonation in 1945. That matters because virtually all steel produced after 1945 carries faint traces of radioactive particles from atmospheric nuclear testing, embedded right into the metal during manufacturing. Pre-war steel doesn't have that contamination, which makes it genuinely valuable for extremely sensitive scientific equipment. Things like radiation detectors and certain medical devices, where even the tiniest amount of background radioactivity in the surrounding shielding can throw off the readings. Hospitals and research labs have actually used salvaged plating from old pre-war warships to build shielded testing rooms. There's a real, if niche, market for exactly this kind of steel, which makes the Nagato's situation almost darkly ironic. Here was a ship built from steel that should have been valuable specifically because it predated the nuclear age, and it was sunk by the very same nuclear age, drenched from bow to stern in irradiated seawater during the Baker test. The one thing that might have made salvaging it financially worthwhile was destroyed by the event that sank it in the first place. For comparison, the Prinz Eugen, another former target ship at Bikini, actually had a formal salvage feasibility study carried out by the US Navy in 1974, weighing salvage cost against scrap value. That study found the cost of raising the Prinz Eugen would run around $7.5 million against a scrap value of barely $1.5 million. And even that ship is smaller, shallower, and sits right side up off Kwajalein. As far as I've been able to find, no equivalent study has ever been done for the Nagato. Nobody appears to have even formally run the numbers, presumably because everyone involved already knew what the answer would be. Today, the calculation has shifted entirely away from economics. In 2010, UNESCO designated Bikini Atoll a World Heritage Site specifically because of its place in the history of the nuclear age, and the Marshall Islands opened the lagoon to recreational divers back in 1996. The Nagato has since become one of the most famous wreck dives anywhere in the world, at one point named by the Times of London as one of the 10 best wreck dives on the planet. Divers descend past its 4 enormous propellers, each over 13 feet across, now pointing straight up toward the surface, and can swim the entire length of the inverted hull, even entering the area near the bridge where Yamamoto once gave the order that pulled the United States into the war. The Marshall Islands government owns the wreck outright, and it has no intention of ever allowing it to be touched. It's their most valuable dive tourism asset, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and by most reasonable definitions, a war grave, all at the same time. So the Nagato is still there because it was too radioactive to even approach in the months after it sank, then too remote and too expensive to justify going after once the radiation question became academic. Then the one asset that might have made salvage financially sensible, its pre-war steel, turned out to be contaminated by the very test that sank it. And now, decades later, it's simply too historically and economically valuable left, exactly where it is to ever be moved. The most powerful battleship in the world when it launched in 1920, the ship from which the order to attack Pearl Harbor was given, one of the last Japanese battleships standing at the end of the entire war, ended up rolling over quietly in the dark with no one watching, and it's been lying upside down on the floor of a Pacific lagoon ever since. Nobody came back for it. Nobody's going to. Now, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, please let me know in the comments, and I'll make more of these for more ships. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss those, and I'll see you next time.